In this slideshow, I'm going to talk about the life of a television series from conception to death, or at least near death. Nothing really dies in television anymore, it just goes away for a while to be dug up later. I almost went into a zombie metaphor there, but I'll let you do that on your own. Anyway, where did TV series come from? Well, of course, initially, they are just an idea that somebody has. And the first thing I'm going to talk about are basically, like I said, the conception of TV, the idea of TV shows, where TV shows come from. Because the reality is, television breeds formulas, and the ideas for TV shows are no different. There are lots of formulas for how to come up with a TV show. So, the way that the process works is initially a writer, a producer, someone begins with a pitch. And a pitch is just a short, recognizable way to explain what a series is about. And what you want to do with a pitch is you want to make something sound familiar, but with some kind of spin, something different about it, that you can get attention to an executive who's going to give you money to make that thing, because they think it's something that their viewers want to watch. So we'll say like, it's just like this show, but with this instead. You don't want it to make it sound like it's exactly the same, but that convention might be, it's a multi-camera sitcom, it's a detective drama, right? It's a comedy like Friends, but they live in a treehouse. I just made that up. If y'all want to run with that series, you can. But you begin with that pitch, right? So you have to have some beginning concept. And sometimes, that concept might be very unique, but often it is closely tied to some already existing person or property, okay? So we have a concept, an idea for a TV show. For example, an example of a concept would be, in the 1980s, there was a sitcom that was set in a bar, and that show was called Cheers. So the convention was, it's a workplace sitcom, but the workplace is a bar. And so it's the people that work at the bar and the customers at the bar as well. And it's multi-camera. That's basically it. Okay? Now, another variation on where TV come from is your show is a vehicle. And a vehicle means that a production studio or a network has some kind of existing relationship with a star, and they want to produce a program around that star. So in this case, in the case of a vehicle, that individual comes before the idea for the show does. In other words, you build a show around a particular performer. So for example, the show Seinfeld was a vehicle for comedian Jerry Seinfeld. He was a successful stand-up comedian, and they wanted to build a show around him, so they figured out a way to do that with Seinfeld and his production partner, Larry David. Okay? So sometimes the vehicle is for the performer, sometimes it's a producer, but usually it's someone that has a proven track record as audiences want to see them, or audiences like other shows that they've produced. So an example of a vehicle would be any number of shows actually that either Ted Danson or Kelsey Grammer have been in since Cheers. Danson has had at least one that was semi-successful. Kelsey Grammer had one that was very successful, but it wasn't just a vehicle. We'll talk more about it in a second. Okay, so we have concepts, vehicles. There are also clones. And a clone, like I said, television can be very formulaic. So a clone basically means that you're taking an existing program and you're trying to make one that is just very similar because you want to appeal to the same audience. A variation of a clone is what we call a recombinant. You take two different shows and you make one that's very similar to both of them put together, right? So clone, example of a clone will be, I mentioned Seinfeld earlier. And often we have sitcoms that are vehicles for comedians, and how they build out that show around the comedian might be an example of a clone. So for example, Ellen, who you probably know from being a talk show host or a game show host, her original show was a sitcom, and it was initially basically a clone of Seinfeld. And in a way, Friends was a clone of Seinfeld as well, although it didn't have a comedian as its central character. It was based on friends living together in New York, or living near each other in New York anyway. Okay. The thing about clone that I want to emphasize is, if you're pitching a series, you're not going to tell them you want to make a clone. You're going to say it's going to be like this, but it's going to be somewhat different. But the reality is, we have a lot of shows that are very similar to other shows, but clones are similar in concept. They're not part of the same licensed property. Okay. The other thing we have is a spin-off. So a spin-off is actually related directly to an already existing show. And what happens in a spin-off is that you have one of the characters of the show who get their own program. It's spun off, in other words. This has been popular throughout television history as a great way to create new shows because you have a character that people are familiar with. You give them a new show, and hopefully that audience goes to that show as well. In the case of Cheers, when that show was canceled, or actually it wasn't, they decided to end the show. Kelsey Grammer got a spin-off of that in which he had his own show set in a different city, different cast, and that show was called Frasier, named after his actual character on the show. And that show actually ran longer than Cheers did. It's an example of a very successful spin-off. You may or may not know there was actually a spin-off of Friends called Joey, and that was a terrible failure. It was not successful. Okay, there's something else, though, that you're familiar with undoubtedly, and that's the franchise. Everybody knows franchise now because of the Marvel franchise, and you have all those different Marvel movies, right? Well, in television, we have franchises, too. So example of a franchise is Law & Order. There are all the different Law & Orders. Or CSI. There's these various different CSIs. The difference here between, you can see with a franchise, is you have various different programs, and they don't necessarily have characters from each other in them, right? The way spin-offs do. They're also not just clones because they're all part of the same property and the same creative team. So that's what a franchise is. A franchise is essentially clones of the same property, spin-offs of the same property, without having like literally the same characters go off and start those. They're similar to each other. All right, another thing that we haven't talked about, in some ways, these different things we talked about, like spin-offs, are a variation of an adaptation. But an adaptation simply means that you're making a television program based on another media property, and that might be based on a movie. It might be based on a series from another country. So, for example, The Office, of course, The Office is an adaptation of a program from the UK, right? And some of it, the early episodes were very similar, but it got different over the years. And The Office is actually a really interesting example to think about how adaptations have to be different. They can't be exactly the same as the original series. Now, recently, we've gotten this other thing called the reboot, okay? And we talked about this in media industry. Those of you that have already had media industries know all about reboots. But the idea with the reboot is that you're taking a show from the past and you're not just adapting it with a whole new cast. You're actually starting it over again, right? You're rethinking that show. And you might include people from the original series, or it might be totally different. But you're actually resurrecting something from the past and starting it up anew. Okay, now, so those are all our ideas. Now, say your executives say, hey, that's a great idea for a show. What they do is they then give you money to produce the first episode, the pilot. And the pilot is really the test run for the series, and that's what we're focusing on with our first writing project. So the pilot has to establish the setting, the narrative problematic, what the series is about, the main characters, and also be really, entertaining. So it's really hard to make a good pilot, because what happens after the pilot is produced is that executives watch it, and then they have test screenings where they have focus groups of around five or so people, sometimes larger, and they test the heck out of that pilot to see if people are going to like it or not. And really, what happens is that executives are looking to reinforce their own, they want to back up their own gut feelings. They want someone to tell them what they feel themselves. They want to come up with some kind of evidence. So there's examples of shows, and Seinfeld is one, that didn't test screen well but still made it to the air. But overwhelmingly, if pilots don't test screen well, they don't make it to TV. Now, if they do well, what happens is generally the network puts in an initial order, and that's just for a few episodes. They don't put in an entire season's worth. In network TV, an entire season is 22 episodes. In cable TV and on streaming, it's often less than that. It may be more about 10, right? 10 to 13, around that number. But initial orders are usually just about 6 episodes. And what that means is, again, they want to see what's this show actually going to be like besides the pilot. And they're going to put a couple of those episodes on the air and see how they do. Often, you'll get 6 episodes produced and only a couple will make it to the air before a show is canceled. It's increasingly hard to get series on air. Okay, now I'm going to just delve very quickly here into where the money comes for this stuff. And it used to be, for most of TV history since the network era, the system of deficit financing, in which the producer of the series owned the program and then they leased it to the network to make back some of the money for actually producing that show. And it's called deficit financing because it costs so much money to make a TV show that you weren't actually making money when it was first leased to the network. So that's the crazy thing about making television. It's so expensive. You don't make money until you have a whole lot of episodes and then you sell them somewhere else. So in deficit financing, that's how it worked. You're producing it, you're leasing it to the network makes money by selling ads, and then you, the producer, only make money if that network continues to renew your series and bring it back for another season. And it's not enough just to bring it back for one season. You've got to get it renewed for multiple seasons so you can turn around and sell it somewhere else and then make money. Now, the pilot system is under attack, and not everyone uses it anymore, particularly Netflix. Netflix has been able to get people to want to make TV with them because they have access to so much capital that they have been funding straight to series, giving producers, writer-producers, showrunners enough money to make 10 episodes straight out of the gate and not just a pilot. That has been an advantage for them in terms of getting people to work with them, but it also meant they've spent a ridiculous, insane amount of money. Amazon is kind of a mixture. They do a little bit of both, and they kind of use this as a marketing ploy where they will put up like 5 pilots at a time and let people watch them and say, you get to vote on them and we'll make a series out of the one that gets the most votes. However, this is kind of a marketing ploy. Once when I did this class, I had everyone in the class watch a different pilot and then write about that pilot and vote for which one they thought should be on. And all Amazon did was they said, surprise, we're sending all of them to series. So it really was just a pure marketing ploy. It wasn't like an actual way to get research. Now, the goal, though, in the traditional model of deficit financing is that you're going to continue to get renewed so that you have more than 100 episodes, which generally takes about 4 years, if each year is about 22 episodes. And then you can turn around and you can sell that off network. That means your series has been on network TV, everybody knows about it, they love it, they want to watch it, and now you can sell it to cable TV, or you can sell it to those other hours on the local affiliates and make lots of money. So there's off-network syndicated programs, and that's what I just described. And then there's first-run syndication. First-run syndication means that it's initially produced just to be syndicated to cable. And that has typically been cheaper programs like something like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune that you have just one set and you can quickly produce them. It doesn't cost a lot of money to do it. The thing about syndication is that every time those episodes air, they continue to pay residuals for the key creative personnel, such as the writers, the performers, and certainly the producers. So that's where you stand to make lots and lots of money in television. And people who get on one sitcom that's on long enough to get 100 episodes are basically set for life. Now, the way things stand now, though, is that there are so many different windows because of all the streaming channels, streaming platforms, as well as all the international channels and international markets that exist, that as a producer, you can license to enough of these different markets ahead of time that you can immediately be profitable. you don't have to go into such a deficit if you can say have a plan that, okay, I've got these overseas markets, I've got this streaming platform. You can put together those in a way where you don't have to go in as much deficit, and therefore it's much more common for us to see one season of it shows on TV for one season and then it's on a streaming platform or it's even on cable, because you don't have to wait as long anymore. All right, that's the end of this show.